The sea seldom slept at the foot of the great keep that faced it, and on some nights its voice was so constant that it seeped into dreams and made them the color of slate water. In such a place a boy grew tall in a hurry, taught to stand with his back to stone while the wind stole his breath and tried to tilt him from the battlements. He learned to laugh against the gale and to shout to be heard, a laugh that rang like a bell across the courtyard and up along the arrow-slitted stairwells. His name was Robert, dark-haired and broad even as a youth, with a spirit that rolled forward like surf, tireless and unembarrassed, and a taste for the simple joys of warm bread and a full flagon and the rush of his own strength answering a challenge. He was a child of thunder and salt, of a castle whose walls had been set here to defy the temper of the sea, and when he strode through the great doors into the hall where the torches smoked and the antlers hung, he did so as if the doors had always been meant to fall open at his step. He had brothers. Stannis, long-boned and narrow as a drawn bow, who already kept accounts in his head and remembered promises in exact words, and Renly, who arrived last into the world with a smile that seemed to have waited for the right face. Their mother's hands smelled faintly of lemon and wool, and their father's voice was a steady drum that spoke of duty, of vassals and old oaths, of the long beam of lineage stretching into the fog of memory beyond the reach of candles. In that hall, while the wind rattled the shutters and the hearth spat sparks, the boys were taught that they were the line of a Storm King's choice, a house that carried the antlered crown as sign and warning both. Robert heard this and grinned and asked for a sparring match. Stannis asked for the roll of lords to be read again, to learn who owed what. Renly practiced the steps of a dance he had glimpsed among the servants. Childhood went on in the measured way of a fortress that expects calamity and is content to outlast it. Then one day the sea took their parents. It was not the first ship devoured off those iron cliffs and not the last, but it was the only one that bore the faces the boys knew like their own. From the ramparts the brothers watched the storm whirl its gray skirts and smash the returning vessel into the teeth of the coast. The spray blew back into their eyes and made everything a blur. Robert stood very still in the rain, as if the water would find its own balance if he did not move. Stannis counted the wreckage silently and understood the numbers meant nothing anymore. Renly held onto the cold stone with both hands and swallowed without finding breath at the bottom of it. When the storm moved on, taking its noise with it, the castle felt too large and the steps to the great hall went down forever. The antlers on the wall appeared to be listening. That night the boys lay awake, and whatever had been left of soft boyhood slipped off them like soaked wool and was carried out with the tide. Thereafter, Robert was sent up into the sky. The mountain roads wound like threads in a loom, and the air grew thin, and at last the Eyrie rose out of cloud, a pale ship sailing the blue. There he came into the care of a lord who had grown gray amid falcons and snow, and there too he met a second brother he chose for himself. A lean, quiet northern youth whose words were as spare as winter and whose silences were not empty but attentive, like the pause before the fall of a pine tree in a forest. Robert filled those silences with stories and boasts, not to cover them but to shelter in them. He told of the Stormland storms and of climbing the towers on a dare. His new friend, Eddard, spoke seldom but listened with the small, steady smile of a person who, once he decides you are his, keeps deciding the same thing every day. The two grew together like trees planted close on a slope, one robust and leaf-loud, the other straight and watchful, their roots tangled under the soil where no one saw. The mountain taught Robert a different kind of endurance. He still swung a hammer with the joy of a boy throwing his weight into the world, but he learned that wind could be an enemy to be spent down, that patience was a kind of strength, that honor had its own quiet grammar. He learned too the ways of court, which is to say he learned how people told truths at angles, how favors were made of cloth that could be cut again and again without ever matching the original bolt, and how laughter might open more doors than anger. He grew taller. He grew into a man's appetite and a man's stride, and he grew, without realizing it, into the habit of believing he could batter any wall that rose in front of him. In the high airy solar where the light came thin and clean, Robert swore to his friend a future of shared adventures. In the yards below, he broke practice lances and replaced them with fresh ones. At table he sang, off-key but loudly, and the serving girls smiled even when he botched the chorus. When the talk in the Eyrie turned to unions and alliances, Robert found himself promised to a northern rose, a girl whose fierce eyes did not match the soft petals of the stories told about her. He saw her only a few times, and in those meetings he felt a surging tenderness that surprised even him. He carried a picture of her in his head that was half memory and half song, bright as moonlight on fresh snow. He spoke of it often to Eddard, who would nod and say little, and to anyone else who would listen, his words weaving a garland he imagined laying at the feet of a future. The world beyond their mountain seemed stable enough to greet such plans. But the world was not stable. Far off, in a fortress that glowered over a lake like a bruise, a tourney ended with a scandal that tasted of prophecy and pride. A prince in whom fire and bookishness had both been lit laid a crown of nearby bloom not upon his own lady but upon robe. Artis, and in that single gesture, as thin and delicate as a petal, whole years began to slide out of place. People remembered the moment the way they remembered a sky before a storm, the color wrong but beautiful. After that, ravens began to fly with black threads in their beaks, and the last of the old peace frayed. The mad king burned a father and son, and what had been grievance became revolt. The quiet lord of the Eyrie raised banners rather than betray the boys he had fostered, and the roads filled with men wearing their houses on their chests, with pikes and bread ovens and shoeless feet. Robert went to war as if he had been born for it, roaring, cheerful, certain. He took upon his arm a heavy hammer half as stubborn as he was, and he painted his shield with the charge of his house, as if to remind the world what sound thunder made. He bled and did not much care, so long as there was singing afterward and the taste of victory like copper and ale. He learned that war was sprint and endurance both. In one town, bells rang and rang while a prince's friend hunted him through the crooked lanes, and he hid in a brewer's loft where the smell of malt clung to his hair even after he escaped. He learned how quickly a river could swallow red stones, how a wound could feel hot on cold mornings, how men who had cheered his name in the square would also watch him without blinking while he slept, their trust absolute. He tasted defeat, the hard bread of it. He learned the weight of a friend's hand on his shoulder when the enemy closed a noose around a place where he had taken shelter. He learned the stubborn light that wakes before dawn and says go again. At last he found himself on a riverbank beneath banners that snapped like jaws, facing the prince whose choice at a tourney had set so many torches to dry tinder. The two lines stood like teeth. The water slid by remembering mountains. When the clash came, it was terrible and it was exact. He moved in the press of men with the particular grace of a large person who trusts his size, swinging in crescents that made empty air where bodies had been. He found the man he sought, and in that moment something of every song he had ever believed about himself stood up inside him. When it was over, the river went on being a river, but what had seemed immutable had been struck from its place. The rubies that had been sewn into a prince's breast spilled and vanished into current. Men who had come to watch two legends contend blinked and then cheered. The cry went up like the flight of starlings, uneven and whole at once. Victory did not taste as simple as he had imagined. The great city opened its gates not to him but to a golden lion whose teeth were hidden in velvet. And when those teeth were bared they found babies as well as warriors. The air filled with smoke and a smell that no one would ever quite forget. Robert looked upon what had been done and told himself it was part of a day already written by the deeds of others, but a shadow lay across his heart all the same, a long thin bar that would be easy to ignore and impossible to erase. His friend arrived too late to stop what had happened and carried away a sister in a bed of blood and tears, and the last of the garlands in Robert's head withered. The rose he had loved had never belonged to him in the first place, and now she belonged to no one. He wore his sorrow like a mail shirt, useful for stopping blows and heavy to carry over miles. Then there was a crown, heavy and old in the hand, colder than metal ought to be. Robert took it because he had one, and because men he trusted told him the realm needed a hammer to keep order, and because, though he did not admit it aloud, he could not imagine stepping aside for anyone else. He married a golden bride to seal a peace he hoped would outlast the ghosts that walked beside him, and he placed his brothers where he thought they might do the most good. One on the island of towers and black stone, another in the castle that had taught them to talk above the weather. He thanked the stern man who had sheltered and taught him and placed that man at his right hand to do the work Robert could not bear, the work of lists and laws and hard truths asked for politely. He rode through the countryside and was hailed as a hero, and he raised cups in roadside halls, and the soldier in him wondered why his pulse had gone quiet. Governance turned out to be a different war. It was a long corridor with doors that did not open to a hammer blow. It was the arithmetic of harvests and tariffs, the careful, constant pressure of men who smiled and said that today was not the day for austerity, that the realm deserved a celebration. Another tourney, another feast, another gesture of magnanimity that would assure the love of the people and purchase time. Robert found it hard to say no where a hearty yes made faces bright and tables loud and sadness for one more night hold its tongue. He discovered within himself a hunger that was not for food but for distraction, for noise to drown the sound of an empty place inside where a snow-bright girl had once stood like a promise. His counsel grew used to his laughter preceding him and to his absence when the talk grew meticulous. He loved as he had fought, with an open hand and an open door, and the city learned to whisper the names of his children who were his and were not, who wore his black hair or did not, whose mothers came and went like weather. He was not without justice, nor without kindness. He would do a hard thing if it was put plainly, but the world he had won did not speak plain as the yard had done. It spoke in favors and drapes, in redecorated chambers and gifts of dogs and hawks, in the gleam of numbers written by clerks who hoped their new totals would pass in a room full of candles. He did not stop being generous. He did not stop being brave either. When an island kingdom rose in sudden pride and set the sea to boiling catch raiders, he gathered his banners without complaint and went once more to the work that had made him. Ships burned. Stone was forced. Men known for grimness did improbable things with torches and prayers. And the king stood on black beaches with salt drying on his beard and remembered that the ground had once moved under him the way a horse moves when it loves you. In those days, the realm saw again the man whose voice could fill a campsite and whose presence made boys straighten their shoulders. He returned triumphant, and brought with him the son of his defeated foe, kept close as a living pledge and a reminder that mercy was another kind of armor a king might wear. Then the years did what years do. They made him slower without making him gentler to himself. The hunts stretched out for days not because the boar evaded him, but because the laughter and the wine kept him from wanting to leave the fires. He said what he thought at tables where others measured words, and he laughed at the suggestion that he could not keep all the pieces on the board with the same brute hand that had once broken men in the press of a shield wall. Debt collected like dust in corners. He relied upon the older friend whose letters stacked like neat wood and smelled faintly of ink, upon a brother whose joints locked like bolts, upon advisors who had learned to stand in each other's light while pretending not to notice it. He held children who called him father and did not see himself in their faces, and felt around that absence the ache of something he could not cure. He avoided the crypts of the north as one avoids a wound that never healed right. When at last the tidy man who had been his compass died suddenly, the king found himself reminded of the original loneliness, the cold hall after the storm, the feeling that the castle had become larger because certain footsteps would never be heard again. He rode north, seeking the friend of his youth, the boy who had become a man of stone and quiet tenderness, and he stood before the old dead of that frozen land and remembered a promise that had never been his to keep. He asked the man he trusted to come back with him and take the quill and the ledgers and the hours of meetings where words are bent into bridges, and the friend agreed not because he loved the work but because the eyes of the king were not the eyes of a king then. They were the eyes of a boy in a storm. Back in the hot city by the glittering bay, the king's court smelled of spiced wine and beeswax and secrets. The streets below the Red Keep made their own bargains while the palace made prettier ones. The king roared and joked and tried to drag his friend into the thick of life, but the friend had come carrying questions, and those questions had teeth. In their old companionship there were new splinters. One had learned hard patience and the other had not, and each could not help but want the other to be more like himself. Word came of a girl with old blood across the sea, married into a tribe whose thunder was hooves, and the king, hearing it, felt again the old rage rise, a night tide, unstoppable once it set in. His friend argued against the killing of a child. The king called for decisiveness. Their love strained. At table their silences were not the comfortable ones of youth. The king sought ease in wine, where the edges of a day softened, and in the company of those who could not wound him with a quiet question. And still he was brave. On a morning that opened amber and hot, he went out to hunt as he had hunted since he had hands big enough to draw a bow. The forest north of the city was a dry green hush broken by insects' gossip. The king rode with men who had reasons to keep him merry, and the wineskin passed too often. This is the part of the tale that must be told softly, because the sound it makes is very human and very small compared to trumpets and rivers full of rubies. A boar rose from brush like a decision long postponed. The king met it not as a king but as the boy who had once stood against sea wind and would not let it push him back. He struck and he was struck. The men around him came with shouts and cloaks to staunch and to soothe, and they carried him home on a litter that felt like a ship's deck in heavy weather. In the cool dark of his chamber, smelling of rushes and old stone, he lay wrapped in the knowledge that his life was not going to go on as it had that morning. He called for his friend and spoke words that came out crooked under pain and drug and memory, and he placed his hope for the realm in a letter that tried to name the future in calm phrases. He asked for forgiveness the way large men ask for anything delicate, with a blunderer's sincerity. When he died, the city did not make a single sound but many, layered atop one another. There was the sound of quiet weeping in small rooms far from the palace, the sound of a goblet set down hard upon a table by someone who had expected to carve another slice from the king's heedlessness, the sound of swords shifting in scabbards because swords understand change. Flags moved to half and rumor leapt the alleys like a stray spark blown between thatches. The friend he had loved, the brother who tallied, the golden queen with the hard, bright eyes. Each of them reached for a future and found that their hands came away wet with the present. What followed was the noise of many hammers, all insisting they were the true hammer. The dead king's memory became a field upon which other men pitched tents. One brother said the law was a blade that cuts clean, and that thrones must be taken by right if they are to be sat upon by men. The other brother said the love of the people was its own right, and that the very brightness of the crown drew light toward the wearer. The golden child upon the throne behaved like a mirror placed in the path of sunlight, blinding, flickering, unbothered by what it could not understand. The northern friend. D found himself surrounded by courtiers who would have drowned a virtue for the price of a new robe, and who spoke treason with the flourish of a stage player hiding a coin. Cities burned or almost burned. Banners multiplied like weeds. In far cities beyond the sea, the old blood awoke with the patience of a spring that begins as a darkened trickle beneath ice. The hammer the king had been could not fall again. Those who had watched him drink and laugh and fight and falter were left to interpret the shape of what he had made. Robert's true legacy moved in smaller ways than war's trumpet. It went on in the steps of a black-haired boy at a forge who knew the weight of a real hammer and did not know why men he had never seen were hunting his shadow. It went on in the careful service of a lean man with a mended hand who remembered a smuggler's night and a starving garrison, and who was loyal beyond logic because loyalty had been answered once with knighthood and a blunt promise. It went on in the stubbornness of the man on the island of black stone, counting ships in his head, and in the laughter of the man in the bright hall of storms who could make a room wish to be in love with itself. It went on in the friend from the north who kept a promise so heavy he had to carry it in silence because any other way would break it. The king's life became the bone of a story around which flesh kept accreting, pieces added by those who remembered him as a shout or a grin or a wave of the hand in a gatehouse as a troop rode out. Some said he had been a bad king and a good man. Some said he had been a good king for a bad time, because bad times needed a cudgel that could knock heads together and make men sit at the same table. Some said that his great sin was not cruelty but neglect, which is a kind of cruelty that wears a mask of ease. When the tales are told by those who love bravery, he is the youth on the riverbank, red droplets sinking into a green current while his laughter rises in astonished triumph. When they are told by those who love order, he is the figure who let sums grow until they blurred into one another. When the storytellers are old soldiers, he is the hand clapping their shoulders after a march, the king who would sit beside the fire and tell them they were the realm and mean it. Everyone remembers the size of him, because size is part spectacle and part comfort. Almost no one remembers how often he apologized to serving girls whose trays he bumped, nor the way he stopped sometimes and looked at a child with such a fierce softness that the child looked away first. The country he left behind learned to stumble along with pieces of him lodged in it. A village remembers a meal paid for twice out of a sudden largesse. A hunter remembers a morning in which the king asked to see the path deer take through the brush and actually listened as if the man had invented the forest. A smith remembers a grip like a clamp and a jest that was not very good but was made with genuine goodwill. Mostly, the realm remembers that he once killed a man upon whom many hopes had hung and then did not know what to do with the silence that followed. It is hard to be a legend from a throne, harder still to be a husband from behind a legend. When winter threatened, men in keeps that smelled of damp stone and old banners said his name with a shake of the head or a thin smile, depending upon what they wanted from the world. They argued what he would have done about this army or that famine, as if the answer would carry a weight heavier than the grain they needed. The truth, of course, was that the king had been a man who loved winning and warmth, and who preferred to be both with his friends beside him. He would have ridden out if there was riding to be done, laughing at the cold, and he would have made the tents into halls by his presence, and then he would have handed the quill to someone else and wandered off among the horses, patting necks and telling them they were fine animals. He would have made some people furious with his carelessness and others devoted by his generosity, and he would have cut a big shape in the air whenever he moved because his body did not understand how to be small. There are still corners of the Stormlands where old men swear they can hear him in the surf on certain nights, a low boom followed by a rattle of foam and stone, and when the weather turns the great castle watches in its old way while the lamps along the walls burn stubborn squares of gold against the gray. The banners crack and the antlers shadow the high hall, and a boy somewhere runs for the joy of running past heaped shields with his breath fogging as he goes. He stops at the doors and holds the iron ring and feels, through cold metal, the life of the place. He flings the door wide and goes in, and there is laughter because in a hall made for storms, a voice like his has always belonged. Robert's story is not a straight road. It loops and doubles back and vanishes into woods before returning mud-streaked and grinning as if it had only been gone for a moment. It is a story of a hammer that did not know how to measure, only how to fall. Of a crown that could not teach a man who preferred the immediacy of field and saddle. Of a love that was more idea than woman and therefore could never have aged into the manageable disappointments of marriage. It is a story about friendship that began in the silence of high air and ended in a city that could not be quiet, about the kinds of promises that make their keepers lonely, about brothers whose differences were gifts while they were boys and became fractures when placed beneath the iron of expectation. It is a story of meals half-eaten because someone told a tale that needed finishing, of hunts that stretched into early light, of the ache in the joints that comes on a damp morning and suggests that not every day is for glory. It is, in the end, the story of a man whose presence filled a room and whose absence did too. And if you sit with it long enough, listening to how it is told in farms bordering the King's Road and in high keeps where ancient swords hang above the hearth, in seaside villages where the smell of brine outlasts the smoke of the cooking fire, you feel the shape of it settle around you like a cloak. He was thunderous and flawed, generous and forgetful, faithful to friendship and faithless in bed, a feast for the eyes and a famine for the ledgers. A king in whom boys recognized the man they hoped to be before they understood kingship was also a pile of small decisions made on dull afternoons. He fought as if the world were a door to be kicked through and ruled as if it ought to forgive him for not being the kind of man who loved doors. When the wind stirs above the cliffs of the Stormlands, it seems to carry his laughter with it, and when the bells of a river town ring for supper or alarm, there is an echo of another day when they rang and rang in search of a young rebel hiding in the crooked lanes. The sea keeps its own counsel. It took his parents from him and gave him a language of noise and persistence. The mountains kept their own counsel too, and gave him a brother not of blood but of choice. The river that ran green over red stones forgot what had been asked of it and simply went on, and that is perhaps the truest thing about Robert's life, that it went on in others. In the faces of bastards mistaken for brothers, in the debates of lords who pretend certainty while fearing judgment, in the decisions of a man somewhere to share his bread with a hungry soldier because once a king did something like that and it made the evening warmer. In these small motions the hammer's echo lingers, not in the great clang that frightened horses and set banners shivering, but in the softer tones that follow a blow, the singing of metal as it cools, the assurance that something has been shaped even if the shape is not what the maker intended. So let us say he stands again upon the ramparts of the great castle where no storm has ever made the walls kneel. The air is bright with salt and the horizon wears its old armor of cloud. He plants his feet the way he always did, as if he were a tree and the stone were soil. He lifts his head into the wind and grins, as if the wind is an old friend who has just told a coarse joke. Somewhere below, waves break and throw themselves backward so they can try again. Somewhere inland, a bell rings for evening. Somewhere far away, a man counts coins. Another breathes a prayer over a sword. Another kisses a ring and lies. Another teaches a child to hold a bow. The king, who is not a king now, rolls his shoulders like a man limbering before a dance, and for a moment you almost expect to see him stride down the steps toward a hall already ringing with his voice. But he is gone, and the sea keeps talking, and the castle does what castles do, and the world, which is always busy with its own next thing, moves forward carrying his story with it the way a river carries whatever you give it. Slipping into depth, flashing in sunlight, making of a man's life a music that is rough and filled with air and never quite finished. After a king dies, his name goes to work in other mouths, and in the hush that follows drums and banners it begins to earn a second life in chalk and ash and old breath. Men and women who did not think about him at all when he was alive discover small uses for his memory. They draw him close to explain a good harvest or a bad law, a new tax or some freshly erected gallows, a child's sudden laughter or a step creaking in an empty corridor. Robert wandered in this way, bodiless and heavy, through kitchens and counting rooms, along mountain paths and across ferryboats that smelled of pitch and river rot. He turned up in the last sips of ale in pottery cups, and in the damp folds of letters sealed with wax. He haunted 1,000 places with an easy familiarity, like the warmth that remains on a chair long after the person has risen and the day has moved on. In a town of crooked lanes not so far from the fork in the river where something red once scattered and vanished into green, a brewer unlocked his shutters each dawn and lifted his old bones carefully into the day. The first breath smelled of damp wood and malt, and of the river's permanent breath, and it always made him think of a night, now long ago, when he had heard heavy boots on his stair and the hushed panic of men who have been brave a little too long. He had hidden a broad-shouldered rebel beneath sacks that sighed grain dust, and for an hour the house had been a heart beating hard and slow. He would tell the story without hurry, making a shape in the air with his cracked hands to show the sweep of a hammer, though he had never actually seen it used on that street. He would end with the part where he had to explain to his wife why there were boot prints on the rafters, and how the next day bells rang as they had never rung, and how his lungs had filled with the sound until he could not remember what silence felt like. When his granddaughter asked what the rebel had looked like, he would say big all at once, like weather and kinder than he needed to be, and that when the man left he put his hand on the brewer's shoulder in a way that made him walk a little taller for a month afterward, as if the touch had rearranged him into a better version of himself. In the city by the glittering bay, where gulls wrote their patient white loops into the sky and the market at the foot of the hill never quite slept, a boy at a forge grew into a young man without fully noticing. He took to iron the way some men take to horses, with an instinct deeper than rules. Sparks cracked like seeds underfoot, and the smell of hot metal, old rain, old earth, and something like lightning soaked into his hair and clothes until even the soaps he sometimes bought with precious coin coup. LD not lift it. A Bravosi master watched and nodded and did not say what he was thinking. That the boy moved the hammer in a circle that other hands had traced, that his arms held a memory he did not own, that the set of his jaw when he concentrated looked familiar in a way that made the master think of rumor, and of a king who had once grinned at him and called him a clever foreigner as if the insult were a toast. The boy made a helm with horns not because horns were useful but because some long echo told him that strength should be given a face, if only to stare back at fear and make it laugh at itself. He wore it in secret, sometimes, late when the coals were banked and the city's vast whisper softened. It felt like a story he might step into and be lost inside, and when he took it off he was only himself again, and the relief and the sorrow of that were almost the same size. Beyond the sea's glitter, up in the chalk-white castle where the air was so thin and clean it felt newly invented each morning, a girl with strong shoulders and a good sense for mule-track ledges carried ropes and baskets as if she were carrying the entire mountain and was pleased to do it. She loved the way sound traveled in the vale, how a voice could leap a canyon like a stone and arrive almost intact on the other side. She loved the steady-footed animals who trusted her hands and the paths that clung like ivy to stone. She had little use for stories that finished with a neat bow. Still, she liked the one about a man who had lifted her once when she was barely more than a baby and set her upon his knee and bounced her so high she had grabbed the air with both hands, just in case, and how he had laughed from deep in the chest as if laughter were a thing he found in his ribs like a tool in a familiar drawer. She did not know how much of it was true. The memory had been buffed by affection and incident and retelling until it shone in places that probably had no luster originally. But she kept it because it did not hurt her, and because the mountain is a serious teacher and sometimes a young woman needs a silly, bright coin to keep in her pocket against days of fog. On a black rock island that rose like a frozen surge from a gray, shouldering sea, a stern man in a narrow hall measured out his days against a ledger that had no mercy in it. He counted ships in his head the way other people counted blessings, and he kept a fire burning in a red, echoing chamber because he feared the cold that lives in indecision. There were nights when he stood at the lip of the sea and let the wind argue with him, because it spoke without flattery and did not soften its questions. He was a brother who had felt slighted and would not say so, a husband who sat squared in his chair because posture was a small thing he could control, a king in nothing yet but fury. In quieter hours he remembered a hand on his shoulder once, a too large hand that had squeezed hard enough to hurt, and a voice that had blustered gratitude for work that no one else wanted. Holding a starving castle, holding a law that no one loved, holding the line that no one would thank you for holding. The memory did not make him kinder to himself, but it kept a stubborn ember alive. He watched coals and he watched men and he watched the realm wearing its mask of normalcy while it quietly rearranged itself into something else. And he said nothing until the moment came when saying nothing would be cowardice. In a bright-hearted camp where banners moved like fish in a shoal, where the cooks told tales better than minstrels and even the horses seemed to approve of the general mood, a charismatic lord ate fruit with zeal and laughed in a way that made men wish to be his mirror. He wore his cloak as if it were a story he meant to live up to, and at night the candles made 100 small moons in the polished cups. He looked so much like a younger, glossier version of the king that both enemies and friends found themselves answering to old instincts. They wanted to cheer for him because his ease made them feel infinitely forgivable. They wanted to rally because their bodies remembered the phenomenon of a Baratheon in full stride. He was, perhaps, a dream of a king more than a king, a promise written in bright ink that the rain had not yet tested. In the dark, some weather with no name approached over the hills. Men whispered about shadows and fires and goddesses who saw farther into night than any candle could. The Lord held a peach once, turning it in his fingers for the pleasure of its weight, and offered it to a visitor whose face looked like a cliff that did not allow climbing. That is what the camp remembers. Not the end, which came with the suddenness of a blown candle, but the peach and the taste of summer caught in the clean bite of it, and the way some men cried without making a sound, because mourning for a luminous possibility is a private act. In Storm's End, the air has always tasted of remnants of storms, as if even on clear days the stone rememberings sift down like salt. The kitchens are deep and patient, and the wind does particular things in the flues that no other castle's wind knows how to do. There, a maester with thin wrists and a nice way with children told the story of the long siege in a voice pitched for beds and blankets. He spoke of a boy's stern mouth and a man's kindness smuggled in the dark and the miracle of tubers at the bottom of a sack that had seemed empty. How a meal can feel like an absolution when a castle has courted starvation for months. He spoke too of letters and ledgers, and how a king's debt to a smuggler might be paid with a title and a new last name, and how not all knighthoods smell of roses. Some wear the clean perfume of onion, and if that seems comic to anyone, it is only because they have not been hungry enough to understand the holiness of a meal. The city's queen, who wore gold as if it were a skin nature had intended, for her and the rest of the world were merely mistaken, sat alone sometimes with a cup of wine and looked at her reflection as if waiting for it to confess something. She remembered a wedding night that felt like a door slammed on the hand of a dream, and a husband whose tenderness came in misshapen parcels, open one day and unreachable the next. She remembered the smell of him on mornings after the hunt, a smell of horse and leaf and wine, and something that her mind, long after, called freedom. She remembered too the way he would call her by the name of a woman who had never lived in this city, and how the insult of that had formed a thin, sharp seam inside her life that nothing could close. In her darkest thoughts, she told herself that she had been born to be the other side of a coin, gold to his storm, calculation to his appetite. In her brighter thoughts, she imagined a sun upon the throne so golden the world would forget there had been any other sort of shine. Memory is a kind of embroidery. Hers was gilt thread and taut canvas and stitches so hard they sometimes tore the cloth. In a vineyard far from the King's Road, where the earth was sweet and forgiving and the vines had learned to trust the hands that tended them, an old soldier put away his sword and picked up a pruning knife that fit his palm like a truth. He had once followed a king who could make a day feel shorter and lighter by sheer force of presence, and to speak of that time was to speak of tents fire warmed in the dark and cups passed hand to hand until the world's edge softened. He did not romanticize the rest. The stink of wounds, the ashes under rain, the way banners looked startled when they lay in mud. He told the younger workers that there is no such thing as a clean victory, only victories one can sleep after, and that his king had tried, in his way, to deliver such nights. He kept a small black antler pinned behind his door, a bit of a badge lost in a melee and found afterward in straw. He touched it like a charm before walking out among the leaves each morning. On the river's edge, where children dug with serious fingers for red stones that might be rubies or might be glass or might be nothing at all, the legend of the ford grew muscular from exercise. It was said that on certain evenings the water held pink deep under its skin, the way a bruise holds a secret. Mothers warned of slippery rocks with their usual clucking. Fathers pretended not to search as they searched, because none of them had outgrown the wish to be suddenly lucky. A peddler made good coin off a box of red beads bought in bulk far to the south. He told himself that he was providing a sacrament of hope. There were always some who said the prince had not died here, that he had slipped away into some other, quiet life, that the story men told of the hammer and the rubies was a pageantry arranged later to make sense of something too bewildering to tell plain. The river did not bother to contradict them. It went on forwarding messages written in leaf and foam from frost to flood and back again. In a square of the city where the cobbles were the kind of uneven that teaches feet to watch where they're going, a captain of gold cloaks adjusted his belt and wished for a post that asked him to move less and explain less. He had once seen a king hold court in public, right there in the open where a beggar could have spat if he had wanted to, and had watched the king settle a dispute between two fishwives with a joke and a promise and a kind of perfunctory grace that still managed to leave everyone feeling heard. Years later, he remembered that scene when daggers flashed in alleys and choices were made that men would pretend were inevitable. He wondered what had been lost that day besides a life, and decided the measure could not be taken with any of the yardsticks he owned. Up at the wall, where the world narrows to a line which, if you are tired enough, you could believe is the final page of everything, the Black brothers told tales to keep the darkness organized. They liked the one about a king who hunted, who laughed, who once clapped a ranger on the back as if the man were a younger cousin and not a stranger. Because the night is long and hard and one requires proof that the far south has not forgotten its obligation to the edges. They spoke with wonder of a later day, when a different king came riding out of cold fire with flags that looked like winter and a woman in red whose eyes carried a candle behind them. They argued whether the red woman was sorceress or simply certainty wearing a red dress. Either way, they agreed the man she served had the hardness of stone and the loneliness of clocks. They decided to like him nevertheless, because the wall standards are stripped of ornament and because when a king bars a gate with his own body, the gesture makes as much sense to a brother of the wall as any prayer. Across the narrow sea, under a sky without the courteous veils of cloud that the West takes for granted, a girl with old fire in her blood stared into a world that had always been told to her as a loss and began to insist upon it as a possibility. Her story ran on its own rails and would have done so with or without a king's death in a city she had never seen. But sometimes she listened to Sel's words drunk on the past and learned the contours of the man who had made space where there had been none. They spoke of his hammer like a god's toy and of a laugh that offended decorum and of a will that did not ask permission. She filed these details away not because she particularly cared to be like him, but because knowledge is meat and a queen cannot afford to go hungry. When a man with a scar would casually call the West the land of storms, She tasted the word and thought how pleasant it would be to teach such places a new name. In a clean, lamplit room where paper nested upon paper with a fussy peace, a clerk bent to his accounts and, for the first time since he had apprenticed to ink, wrote a line that could not be reconciled with any other. He stared at it a long time. In his mind, he saw a king stand from a table where maps had been spread like bread, say something brash and warm, and exit into a corridor with a gate that made torchlight look like a ship's motion. The clerk dipped his quill again and made the numbers behave, because that is what clerks do. They make reality presentable, and they leave the thorns of the thing to pierce other hands. But in the quiet of night, he thought of a man whose rule had left behind 100 such clever reconciliations and wondered whether kingdoms, too, can run a deficit of attention, a debt that comes due not in coin but in confidence. Sometimes the old friend from the north visited in memory by way of scent and texture rather than words. The dry comfort of wool on a high, cold day, the feel of a banister smoothened by generations of hands, the cool patience of stone under torch smoke. He had loved a sister and lost her to the long arithmetic of consequences. He had followed a friend into a world that did not appreciate the kinds of sentences he liked to speak. He had tried to bring order to a city whose mischief wore perfume. He was, in his way, another measure by which people held Robert accountable. The northern man's honor as ruler, perhaps, the more exacting for being unadorned, and therefore a sharp contrast to the king's generosity which, like the sea, behaved with its own logic and flooded occasionally into places no one had intended to irrigate. When he died, the city blinked as one does when stepping into sunlight. When his bones were carried home, the North put on silence like an old coat and wore it with dignity. Several men said, carefully, that the king's death had been the beginning of the end. A few said no, it had been the friends. At the Blackwater, the river that had once gone about its business with a shrug learned how to scream. Green fire raised reaching hands from the surface, and the air smelled of alchemical lime and singed beard and a terror older than childhood. The battle was a scholar's paper on contingency. There were chains and there were towers, and there were men whose idea of courage was neither poetry nor madness but engineering. In the small hours afterward, when the shocked survivors spoke, they wondered what the battle would have been if the hammer of the previous age had been there to swing, whether the outcome would have been tidier or simply louder. There is no way to know. There rarely is. Men are fond of substituting conjecture for comfort. The river accepted their speculations and moved on thickly, as if tired. 2 children, fair as sunlight on coins, grew like vines trained around a trellis of expectation. They had been born into a palace where whispered talk took the shape of care and of knives, and they learned early the difference between a room that welcomes and a room that watches. They had a mother who loved them so fiercely that it sometimes bent justice into new shapes that looked, from a distance, like mercy, and a father who had been a father by law and not by blood, who gave them gifts large enough to fill whole afternoons and inattention in equal measure. When the boy tried to imagine the man in the songs, the one who had slain a prince, he found nothing in himself that matched, and he decided that men must be factories for stories the way ants are factories for tiny roads. When the boy became king, in fact, the crown fit his head the way a torch fits a moth. The girl watched and learned and filed away, because there are many ways to survive a palace, and some of them require patience more than courage. On slow coastal nights, fishermen mended nets by lantern and told the tale of the hunt that had gone wrong, because men who live by water know better than to think that any morning cannot conclude with a long fall into dark. They spoke respectfully of the boar, as all honest men do who understand that their place in the food chain is arbitrary and contingent. They argued whether the wineskin had been refilled too often. Some claimed the king had gone out that day determined to fight something he could not name, as if the beast under the brush were standing in for all the beasts one cannot wrestle in a throne room. Others said nonsense. Accidents did not acquire intention simply because they were inconvenient. The nets grew mended under the hum of their talk, and the boats went out before dawn, and the sea shrugged without malice. In a hidden room where delicate chairs sat like careful birds, the small men who moved the world by moving whispers met and traded furs of rumor. They had served one king and would serve another. They had watched a kingdom built and watched it drift, and they learned the lesson that motion looks like function even when purpose is absent. One of them had liked Robert more than he had expected to. The man's size had at first seemed a liability to subtle work, but now and then the spy had watched the king cuddle a crying dog as if he understood perfectly what pain dogs keep, or stop during a procession to take a child from a mother's arms and toss the boy once, twice, and hand him back with a kiss, and such things make a watcher's heart complicate its tidy sums. Another of them detested the king for his carelessness, because carelessness destroys plans the way wind destroys carefully stacked leaves. They argued quietly about legacy and about whether charm is a virtue or simply a solvent in which virtues dissolve. They said nothing aloud about the nights when they dreamed of hooves and campfires and a huge silhouette at the edge of everything. A septon in a village near the King's Road, a man with a pleasant singing voice and a tendency to go on a little too long, told the story of Saul and David as if it belonged to his own land, and his congregation nodded as people do when they recognize themselves in or in masks. Later, at a wake for a farmer whose knees had worn themselves into gravel pushing a plow, the septon lifted a cup and named the farmer a better king of his own fields than any crowned man, and a woman laughed and said that crowns sit on heads for a few years, but a furrow is a crown that your grandchildren walk, and the septon decided to put that into his next sermon. The dead man's sons carried him out under a stretch of sky that had not decided whether it was finished with rain. The septon went back to his tiny cell and wrote down a line about kings and fields, and then, without intending, he wrote the name Robert, and then, also without intending, he drew a little crown on the R. He blushed, and drew a cross beside it to remind the symbol of its place, but he did not erase it. Some nights in the Red Keep, a guard making his rounds stopped before a window and listened to the city breathe. He had served 3 kings without moving quarters, and he had learned that allegiance is partly a matter of staircases and last names. He had once seen Robert stagger drunk and contrite into a hall where he was expected to be angry. Instead, he had clasped a noble he had meant to berate and told him, clumsily but clearly, that the man's son's bravery had not gone unremarked. The guard could not remember the noble's face. He remembered the embrace because it had made the hall feel briefly like a room in a smaller house, the sort of house where men take off their boots at the door and wives look up from the hearth and say, "There you are," as if they had worried a little. After the king's death, the guard kept that memory because it reminded him what rooms can be if men choose, and because his own son had run away to be a sellsword and this city was the only thing left he could protect that resembled stability. In a forest close to where the boar had made its home, where the ground's softness kept the echoes short, a hunter paused at a scar on a tree that was not a scar of time but of tusk. He laid his hand flat against it, as if a hand were a salve that helps bark remember what it is supposed to feel like. He offered a silent remark, not exactly a prayer and not exactly a curse. The forest accepted it. He had a daughter who liked to rub the boar's bristles he kept tied to a leather strip on his belt. She called them king's whiskers because her mother had once said something careless in the kitchen while chopping onions and a child's ear had taken it as doctrine. Sometimes on late afternoons, when the light went golden and the insects quiet tired for a moment, the hunter would step into a clearing and, without knowing why, feel he had arrived at a small chapel built of leaf and air. He would take off his cap and stand as one does at thresholds. In a manor somewhere between the Stormlands and the Reach, a widowed lady lifted a cup at the first dinner of harvest and told her hall, with kindly imperiousness, that they would drink to the man who had made this peace possible even if he had not known how to keep it. She liked the thought of the king because he had been rude about her vegetables in a way that had felt like honesty rather than taste. He had told her, during a quick visit years ago, that her spinach reminded him of a boot heel and then eaten 2 helpings, and afterward he had insisted that the house dogs be let in because a hall without dogs was, in his esteem, like a river without fish. She had indulged him, and his laughter had made the rafters smile in their way. After, when he was gone, she had taken to setting a bowl at the hearth on feast days, as if the dogs might come and tell her how the world goes. Since his death, she had poured into that bowl a little of her best wine. The dogs drank it with the gratitude of creatures who live entirely in the present and have no use for posthumous symbolism, and that pleased her too. A boy who had been born in a brothel and knew it, a child whose sense of his own worth rose and fell with the tide of compliment in other people's eyes, once had a pretty mother who held him and called him sweet names and told him that a king had held him too and kissed his brow. Later she told men for coin that the child's father had been the king, because men like to purchase adjacency to power almost as much as they like to purchase the thing they came for. The boy grew older and the story abrased itself down to a tiny bright bead. He kept hidden somewhere near the part of his heart that changed size depending on who was in the room. When soldiers came one day with questions that had too sharp a point, her story ceased to be an adornment and turned into a doorway through which trouble entered. Afterward, there were people who said it had been better to tell no story at all. There were others who said that if kings insist on being stories in other people's mouths, they should own the endings of those stories even when the ink smears. The boy hated all of them without knowing their names. He took a different name and a different road and did not look back. The Red Priestess who traveled with the stern brother kept coals in brass and wore certainty like a jewel that glowed of its own accord. She said the name of her god with the confidence of someone who has never been told no 3 times in a row. When she looked into flames, she claimed to see answers, and sometimes, being honest, she did. Fire is a tireless talker and will tell any story if you stare long enough. Between visions and victories and catastrophic misreadings, she thought occasionally of the dead king because she had to. He was the root from which her chosen king claimed right, and even a root one dislikes is still a root. In her private theology, which she would not have shared and perhaps could not have, Robert was a necessary mistake through which light had threaded itself painfully into the world. She did not mourn him. She simply included him in the long arithmetic of a God who counts in centuries. On winter nights in Windy Hall and Parchments and Half-Drowned and all the other small keeps tucked like buttons into the Stormland's great coat, the lords counted barrels and remembered a boy who had, in the earliest days, run in this same courtyard with a laugh that made dogs bark in sympathy. They remembered the day the storm took his parents, the way he had not wept where they could see. They remembered him coming back crowned and taller in ways that had nothing to do with bone, how he had lifted their children into the air like bags of grain, and how somehow the children had felt lighter afterward and had been easier to get to sleep that night. They remembered their banners laid at his feet like old dogs laying down heads, and they remembered the years when he did not come back because the city had eaten him, slowly, with silver service and sugared figs and arguments about stairs. They forgave him without saying so, because forgiveness in such cases is not for the dead but for the living, to keep salt from corroding metal. In the Vale, the air is so clean that lies have a harder time lighting, and yet even their stories did their quiet evolutions. A boy in livery told another boy the tale of the fosterlings who had climbed high and learned to love one another as if the mountain had declared them kin. He added a detail about an eagle that had flown so close the boys could see the yellow curve of its beak. His friend added a detail about one of them standing on the lip of a snowfield and shouting down into cloud in order to hear his own echo multiplied. Neither could say if these things had happened, but they agreed that they ought to have, and so they entered the tale as if they had always been there. In the kitchens, a woman kneaded bread and thought of a young lord who had thanked her for crusts in a way that made her hips tingle for an hour afterward, and she laughed at herself, for she had been married to a man who pulled 9 children from her, and girls who have had 9 children are not supposed to keep such silly heat in them. But stories do not consult the laws of dignity. They slide wherever there is slope. In Old Town, a man with a chain around his neck that made a fine, sad music when he shrugged red records written in brown inks by men now dust. He held a report of grain yields from the 12th year of a certain king's reign and traced with his finger the little dip that meant drought in one county. He tried to remember whether that was the year of the Great Tourney or the year of the Ironborn raids, and then he wondered why it mattered, and then he realized it mattered because to understand anything about kings one must understand appetites, their own and those they awaken in others. His student, a boy with ink on his lip, asked whether the man had been a good king. The maester said that most kings produce, besides their specific acts, an odor. That this man's odor was of leather and wine and wet dog and warm bread and copper pennies after rain, and that he had been, like all men, a balance of impulses and inattention. The boy wrote this down dutifully. Later, when he lit the lamps at twilight, he repeated the words under his breath because they pleased him, and because they seemed to fill the room with a big presence that made loneliness less articulate. On days when the wind blew in unchanged from the sea and got into hair and temper both, the Stormland's small folk said the weather was remembering itself. They would sit under an awning that had seen better winters and talk about how the new wars felt smaller and sharper at once. Not the old kind that had been sluggish and broad-chested like the king who had started them and stopped them by simply deciding to do so. They spoke of the latest taxes and of soldiers who looked hardly older than their spears, and of a rumor of dragons that had traveled on ships' keels from east to west and picked up barnacles of nonsense along the way. An old woman, reading Weather and Birds, claimed she had seen a flight of starlings turn in a pattern like a crown. A boy asserted passionately that starlings always do that. A man with a scar told them both to hush, because the rain was beginning to come sideways and no one benefited from being wrong about the immediate future. There was a place in the Red Keep where dust gathered even though servants were zealous. A tiny landing where no one stood because it stood nowhere anyone needed to go. There, a drop of fat from a candle had fallen years ago and made a shape like a stag if you squinted and were inclined to see such things. A girl new to the palace duties found it during her first month and went back to it sometimes during her first year, and then less often in her second, and then forgot it by her fifth because people make new devotions and the old ones lose their shine through no one's fault. A boy who would later become a steward came upon it without knowing its history and thought only that wax makes maps of nothing in particular, but that men draw borders on them later with their eyes. He wiped it away one morning because the queen had ordered a certain corridor to be cleaned to a gloss that would shame water. He watched the smear disappear and felt, as people often do when they tidy their world, both loss and relief. It is possible to suggest that a man is not gone so long as his laugh lives in a certain cadence that other men imitate without meaning to. Once at a wedding far inland, two groomsmen fell into a habit of telling jokes the way the dead king had told them, with a generous sloppiness and a certain rhythm that promised a punchline would arrive even if it had to be pushed up the hill by hand. No one there had known the king, but half the hall decided he must have been a relative because the imitation was so affectionate it made a family where there was none. There is a kind of victory in this, the small victory of being a template around which strangers assy. Blee a happiness. When the stern brother marched north with fire on his banner and certainty in his shadow and stood at the end of the world telling it that it was not allowed to end, he did not think of the dead king so much as he thought of a younger self who had once been told to hold a castle and had done so until the ropes in his soul creaked. But the men he led thought of the king, because men like to carry more than one story at a time. It is a comfort to have options when the night presses up like a wall of teeth. They said that the dead man would have laughed even then, and then hammered. They said the living one counted and then burned. Both were necessary, and perhaps that is the truest thing any large family learns, that you cannot get through winter with only one kind of man. Somewhere in the Reach, a singer who had never been to court sang a song about Robert that made him into a shepherd taller than sheep and gentler than storms and married to his flock in a way that bordered on the ridiculous. The tune was good and the words were bad and the villagers liked it anyway, because the point of a song is not to tell the truth, but to create a truth-shaped place to curl up in after a long day. When a hedge knight passed through and heard it, he laughed until he coughed and then taught the singer a better chorus, one that remembered the prince and the rubies and the river, and told him how to make the hammer sound like the falling of a barn door in a gale. They drank together, and for a while the hall took on the thickness of old time. All the while, in rooms high and low, men of numbers tried to reconcile accounts that refused to be quiet. The crown weighed more than it used to, not because gold grows heavier with age, but because obligations are a metal of their own. Those men and women of figures learned to speak in euphemisms that could lull a king without lying to him. We can defer, they said, we can restructure, we can count on spring. The dead king had loved spring with a specific, personal fervor. He had been the sort of man who looked at the first budding on a bough and was prepared to declare that winter had been badly advised and should be ashamed of itself. Maybe that is why the accounts had gotten like this, perhaps that is why not. There is always more than one reason for anything that matters. If you walk a long enough road, you end up in Dorne eventually because all roads seek sun when their feet tire. There, under trees that are careful with their shade and in gardens where water is arranged to pretend wildness, men and women of principled leisure remembered a cousin whose life had ended in a scream that the mountains had not forgotten. They thought of the dead king in the same breath because grief makes unlikely neighbors, and because when men die on a field men remember all the dead who touched that field with their eyes. A woman with sand in her blood and a mind like a looped scarf said that the king had not killed so much as he had been the instrument of killing, that the man inside the legend had probably been simple to love and difficult to live with. She bit into a fig and the sweetness ran down her wrist and she licked it away with no shame. Across from her, a man who had once trained with a spear nodded and said nothing because sometimes agreement is better expressed by not disturbing air. There were nights in King's Landing when the moon made broken glass into a sea of little torches, and the alley cats moved like spirits looking for doors. On such a night, a once hand to the dead king sat in a room that had learned his habit of neatness and opened a letter he already knew the contents of because he had been writing it to himself in his head for 3 days. He had loved the king, that was true. He had been exasperated by him, that was truer. He had taped together a kingdom like a man mending a torn banner in wind, his needle always skipping because the cloth would not hold still. He had laughed with him once or twice, genuine laughter that had surprised him as much as anyone. He wondered if this city would ever appreciate the quiet work of men like him, the darning of holes that allowed others to tramp across the carpet. He wondered too if the dead king had ever noticed his gratitude, softly delivered, for the hours someone else had spent in his name. He did not think so. He sealed the letter with wax that smelled of bee and lavender and put it with the others whose destinations he could no longer control. A sword remembered him. Swords are not sentimental. They like sharpness, good oil, honest work. But steel has a way of keeping the echo of the hands that wield it, and the blade that had attended the king, though he had favored the hammer, bore the ghost warmth of his grip and a faint insistence on being lifted high. It leaned in a rack with others and waited like a well-trained dog. Now and then a squire polishing hilts would feel a small push in his wrist that made him raise the thing beyond the sequestered level of chores, and in that brief angle the room seemed to expand, and he would feel foolish afterward and hide the flush by working too hard. Steel knows when it has been seen. Men speak often of heirs. The dead king had sons and not sons in numbers that made accountancy awkward. Some of those boys kept their father's murky legacy like a hard stone in the pocket. Some cherished it like an old ribbon. A few flung it away and insisted on the invention of themselves as wholly new. Of the unacknowledged many, one swung his hammer and put his back into other men's work until his palms were calloused enough to answer questions no priest could frame. Another climbed mountains for a living and wore the sky on her face. Another would stare from time to time at the space above a mantle as if a shape might appear there, a full-bodied laughter visible to the eye. In the arithmetic of blood, the king had spilled his share and sown more. In the arithmetic, I see of love, which keeps entirely different books, the sum could not be calculated with integers. It was a murmuration of small loyalties and injuries, all of them precise and unrepeatable, all of them continuing. In the deeper vaults of the Red Keep, where old casks lay asleep and stone exhaled yesterday's cool, a mouse made a life from borrowed crumbs. The mouse had no use for kings except as a unit of noise and crumbfall. Very large men throw larger feasts, and their gestures tend to free more food from plates than small men's gestures do. After the king died, the mouse's life did not change at once, but over time the pattern of crumbs altered. Where there had been rough bread, there were sugared cakes, which the mouse liked but which left a crunch in the whiskers that predators could hear if they were clever. It is perhaps cruel to say, but true. To mice, most kings are the same unless they break the pattern of crumbs. This one had broken it decently for a while. The mouse did not mourn him. It simply learned to listen differently, which is a reasonable response to politics. Years went by as years do. Scribes changed hands at desks. The wax in certain candles was replaced by a different supplier's wax without anyone noticing. Children who had known the king only as a noise grew into people with opinions about him. In the Stormlands, a man who had been a boy when Robert first rode back with a crown told his son that the king had been a lout and a legend both, and the boy asked whether those two could live in the same house. The father laughed and said yes. They are brothers and fight and borrow one another's clothes, and sometimes one goes to market wearing the other, and no one knows the difference until something breaks. Meanwhile, in a chamber of the castle that faced the sea with the dignity of long patience, a tapestry went on gathering dust and salt smell and the tiny brittle bodies of insects who mistake wool for world. It depicted a hunt, as many tapestries do, because hunts lend themselves to threads and to the illusions of men controlling nature. In the foreground, a figure with a dark beard and an easy seat upon his horse leaned far forward as if eager to kiss the day. The tapestry was old enough that colors had been tamed by time. Still, the antlers on the coat were bright enough to declare their intent. Children asked whether the man was the king. "He is a king," their elders said. careful because it is the business of age to keep the world slippery enough to require questions. The sea outside shoved at the rocks with its old ferocity and then fell back laughing in foam. Somewhere in the castle a corridor took a draught and sang it for a moment, a plaintive note like a bottle's rim. People paused and listened and moved on. Across the narrow sea again, in a city that floats upon God talk and trade, a banker counting debts on fingers manicured like tactics considered the late king's trailing sums with professional disinterest. He thought of debt as a person might think of a well-trained hunting dog, valued when it obeys, dangerous when it remembers its own teeth. Robert had walked around his debts, patting them, shushing them, feeding them scraps. Now they were grown and needed choosing to heal or to bite. The banker smiled because he had no skin in the game beyond the coins that sat like tidy sunsets in his vaults. He was wrong about that. Everyone has skin in the game of kings, but it is a skin of which they are often unaware until it is gone. And what of courage? The old dogs of the Stormlands ask each other when the hearth goes low and the rain begins to remark itself upon the shutters. What is courage after the field, when the standard has been rolled and the songs have been sung? It is, perhaps, the courage to sit in a council you do not like and do the work you are not made for because someone you love asked you to and because the kingdom you have made does not deserve the injury of your sudden disinterest. It is the courage to say no to the extra cup when the man across from you is pouring not wine but forgetting. It is the courage to look upon a child who resembles you archaically and to decide to give the child bread even if you do not give him your name, or to give him your name even if you cannot give him bread. It is the courage to die of a cut that might have been avoided and to apologize through the blood for the inconvenience. Kings can manage that much. Men sometimes can. Robert managed parts of it badly and beautifully and like himself. The storm that took his parents did not retire after. It simply went about its work elsewhere. The storm that he had been large, impatient, merciful in gusts, destructive in others, spends itself slower. Somewhere a woman who sells eels calls her daughter by a name she might not admit comes from him. Somewhere a boy who works a bellows dreams of a laugh he has never heard and wakes comforted. Somewhere a noble who would have despised him on principle discovers, late, the seduction of generosity and does not know whom to thank for the impulse. Seeds blow. Rocks age. A crown, tucked into a chest for a day of ceremony, takes on the smell of cedar and chains and the last finger to touch it. When men take it up, they will say that it feels heavier than story, lighter than duty. They will not be wrong. If you want to find him, you must stand in certain places at certain hours. On the ramparts of the old castle at the exact moment the sun makes the sea look hammered. By the stables in a northern keep when the horses, full of oats and gossip, start in with their chuffing. In the middle of a camp when sudden laughter rolls through men like heat in the back of the throat. On the bank of a river where a prince once fell and the water keeps failing to remember it. In a forge when the iron is the particular color of cherries and the apprentice forgets for 3 breaths that he is anyone. He exists there not as a ghost to be placated, but as a pressure that makes the next choice slightly different than it would have been. At table you might feel a hand near your shoulder and the urge to make a big promise just for the joy of it. In bed you might hear something like hoofbeats very far away and sleep better, believing foolishly that someone else is awake to take the watch. Night draws its long dark cloth over king and mouse alike. In that cloth are stitched the small reflective points of things we have chosen to remember because they make sense of us. Among them is a hammer's arc, a broad back, the human heat of a man who tried to be the thing his body told him he already was. He was loved, he was resented, he was forgiven, and he was not. He was, for a while, the tallest shape in the door, and he is now, a sound that we hear in storms when they come arguing and leave laughing and we are left to clean the gutters and make soup and tell our children that the house will hold. He is the story a brewer tells on quiet afternoons when the river seems to be listening. He is the shape of a helm on a shelf in a dim room that smells of old metal. He is the look on a stern man's face when the stern man allows himself, once in a winter, to wonder what it might feel like to laugh without measuring it. He is the weight of a hand upon a shoulder, an imprecise blessing that still works. And the sea goes on. It lifts its long body under the moon and sets it down again, a creature of habit that pretends variation the way men pretend permanence. The castle watches the sea with its heavy lidless eyes. The banners flutter like thoughts trying not to settle. Somewhere a fire dies to embers and someone leans forward to see if there is enough there to coax another hour of heat. Somewhere a woman hums a tune about a hunt and a river and a girl who wore a crown of flowers not meant for her, and the tune smooths its way into sleep. The night presses its face against the window and breathes, fogging the glass for a moment, and then clearing, and then fogging again, as if the world is alive and wants us to see that it breathes too. If you are quiet, you can almost hear hooves, and a laugh, and the soft thud of a hammer falling a long way off where work is still being done.